everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of Brewing with 50 bucks. This is the show where we take your favorite commanders, we slap on a $50 budget, and not only do we make it viable, but we also make it available to win. My name is Stefan. You can follow me in my socials in the bottom left-hand side of your screen right now, and I'm coming to you from the General Warfare headquarters. Again, from last week, I apologize for the 2-week delay. The entire story in a nutshell was that my hard drive completely crapped out on me, and I lost most of my footage. A lot of it got corrupted, and I was waiting for about 2 weeks to get my hard drive fixed up. So it's back up and running now, and I'm back up and running on my regular schedule. Since the month is October, which means Halloween, which means spooky season, and for me personally, which means horror movies. Ultimately, if you don't know already, based on the shirts I wear on this show, I am an avid horror movie lover, and I almost exclusively watch horror movies. So I wanted to try something new this month, and if it's successful, maybe I'll do it in future videos for the rest of the month, and maybe future videos throughout the next couple of years. However, I wanted to make an entirely new brew based on some of my favorite horror movie icons. So this could be from anything from the old Universal monsters to stuff from the 80s to modern day horror movie icons. So I wanted to take a stab at it in today's video and focus on one of my absolute favorite horror movie icons ever, Freddy Kruger. So Freddy Kruger, also known in the movie universe as the Springwood Slasher, officially made his debut in 1984 in A Nightmare on Elm Street, directed by the late Wes Craven and played by the legendary Robert Englund, who actually signed my copy of the Nightmare on Elm Street collection. Take a look at that shit. The franchise would run until 2009 up to this point, with multiple sequels, some better than others, and with the 2009 version actually being played by Jackie Earle Haley, who you might actually recognize more as Rorschach from the Watchmen movies. Got a chance to play the Dreamwood Killer. And today, I made a custom card for Freddy Kruger, and I wanted to break down an entire deck built around Freddy Kruger. So without further ado, without completely sounding like a broken record, let's take a look at the Springwood Slasher in Magic the Gathering card form, and let's see what we can build out of this, shall we? Freddy Kruger is a 3/3 for 4 hybrid black-red legendary spirit minion that has, whenever he enters the battlefield, creatures your opponents control cannot attack, block, or activate abilities until your next turn, and has the activated ability to black and tap him to destroy target creature. Its controller loses life equal to that creature's power, and you gain life equal to its toughness. This is a very interesting commander, built having a activated and a triggered ability. So the activated ability allowing you to destroy a target creature and not only have your opponent lose life, but you gain life as well. But whenever Freddy enters the battlefield, creatures your opponent can control can't attack, block, or activate abilities until your next turn, basically negating them from doing anything creature based on their turns. This entire deck is built around not only the activated ability, but the triggered ability as well, but we're taking more in initiative with the enter the battlefield ability. And as always, we build these decks with a $50 budget in mind, which includes the price of the commander. In this case, since he is a custom card, we are adding a $1.50 to Freddy Kruger. I feel that's a good base price for this card, which excludes the price of the basic lands. And with this, we offer a $5 overage compromise, which means for the most part, people can afford the extra $5 to build these kinds of decks. So we offer that compromise to that as well. You can find the deck list in the show notes down below. And don't forget to like this video, share it amongst your friends, subscribe to the channel, and hit that bell icon to be notified of every future video that comes out of the channel. So we're going to be breaking it down into the regular categories for Magic the Gathering, starting with creatures, instants, sorceries, enchantments, artifacts, and lands. So we will be getting started with the creatures. So with this deck, we have an abundance of creatures. We are running about 18 creatures in this deck, and we're going to get started off with Agitator Ant. So with Agitator Ant, at the beginning of your end step, each player can put a +1/+1 counter on a creature they control, and you go to each creature that has counters. So that means they put counters on their creatures, and until their next turn, they have to attack if able, and they have to attack a player that is not you if able. So this is a very strong ability, which means this deters attacks going your way, and you can easily kill any one of their creatures with Freddy. Next is a Crowan Horse. A 0/4 for 4 with Defender, and when it enters the battlefield, an opponent gains control of it. At the beginning of your upkeep, each opponent creates a 1/1 white soldier creature token. So with this, you just give it to one of your opponents, and you can just kill it to gain some extra life, and it also creates tokens for you to snipe as well. Emberwild Captain allows you to become the Monarch. This is one of the 3 Monarch cards we are running in this deck. This deck is, I'm going to be honest with you, a little all over the place. However, this is one of the more fun Monarch cards in this deck. So whenever an opponent attacks you while you're the Monarch, it deals damage equal to the number of cards in their hand. So this deters your opponents from attacking you. If they attack you, they're taking damage for each card they have in their hand, as long as you're the Monarch. And with this deck, we have multiple ways of getting Monarch as well, 3 of which actually. Next card we're going to be looking at is Flame Rush Rider. Whenever it attacks, you create a token that is a copy of another target attacking creature that's tapped and attacking. You exile the token at the end of combat. Next we're looking at Florian, Voldaren Scion. This is one of the key cards that we're going to be adding in this deck, since this synergizes a lot with Freddy. So what Florian does is at the beginning of your post-combat main phase, you get to look at the top X cards of your library, where X is the total amount of life your opponent's lost this way. You exile one of them and put the rest of the bottom of your library in a random order, and you can play the exile card that turn. So imagine with Freddy, you hit your opponents for 5, you kill one of the creatures, you snipe 5 life off them, you gain 5 life, and basically with Florian at your post-combat, you get to exile the top 5 cards, you get to put 1 useful card and put it into your hand as well. Pretty clutch, I would say. It's good utility, especially when you have a commander that allows you to deal damage directly to your opponents. Fumiko the Low Blood is a 3/2 for 2 red that has a Bushido X, where X is the number of attacking creatures. This is basically a defensive card that I decided to put in this deck. That way your opponents would not be attacking you super often. You're going to be protecting Freddy as much as you can. Each creature your opponent controls attacks each combat if able. This is incentivize your opponents to attack, but with Fumiko on the field, it gets +X based on how many attacking creatures are going your way, or attacking in general. Hunted Dragon is one of the 3 cards that reward your opponents with creatures. The first of which with a Crow and Horse. Hunted Dragon is the next one, where it enters the battlefield. You target opponents creates 3 2/2 white knight creatures with first strike. So you could just play the Hunted Dragon, give your opponents 2/2s, and then you could snipe one of them with Freddy, nicking them for 2, and you gain 2 life as well. The next is Hunted Horror. Now this one is a little different. It comes into play with 2 3/3 green centaur creature tokens, but it has protection from black, so Freddy wouldn't be able to target them really. However, having a 7/7 trample for 2 mana is really dope. Karavek the Merciless is another really fun, spiteful card that I decided to add in this deck. Good combination and good utility for Florian as well. Basically, whenever an opponent casts a spell, it deals damage equal to the spell's converted mana cost to any target. So ultimately, you're going to be flinging a lot of damage around the board. Karazakar the Eye Tyrant is a new card that we saw in Forgotten Realms Commander. So whenever you attack a player, you get to tap and goad one of your opponent's creatures, and whenever an opponent attacks another one of your opponents, you and the attacking player get to draw a card and lose a life. So this incentivizes your opponents to attack each other instead of yourself, and it rewards them as well, gaining an extra card. It incentivizes you to attack them and allow one of their big creatures to be goaded and to attack another player as well. The next card we're going to be talking about is Carter, Doom Scourge. This is one of the cards I base Freddy Krueger's ability off of. So whenever he enters the battlefield, until your next turn, creatures your opponent control can attack each combat if able and attack a player other than you if able. So it's basically go to your opponent's creatures, and whenever an attacking creature dies, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. This is an interesting ability since this would also stack with Freddy's ability. However, Carter basically only goads your opponent's creatures. They don't nullify activated abilities as well. So Carter basically is a pseudo Freddy Krueger in this case. Kazul, Tyrant of the Cliffs, is another very defensive card. Basically, whenever a creature an opponent controls attacks you, and if you're the defending player, you get to create a 3/3 ogre unless that creature's controller pays an additional 3. So effectively, if you want to negate or nullify your opponents from attacking you. You play Kazul, and each time they try to swing in with their big army, you're going to be creating ogres for however many times they cannot pay. I think it's a pretty sound defensive strategy with this card. Magus of the Wheel is next. So this is budget Wheel of Fortune and all the other wheel cards. I like to add this in my budget decks mainly for the discard your hand, draw 7. It's a budget alternative to having to spend $400 or $500 on an old card from the reserve list. Slaughter Specialist is a new card that we saw in Midnight Hunt. So whenever it enters the battlefield, each opponent creates a 1/1 white human creature token. And whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, you put a +1/+1 counter on Slaughter Specialist. This combos well with Freddy. So whenever Freddy kills one of your opponent's creatures, you get to not only drain them and gain life based on their power and toughness respectively, but you're also putting a +1/+1 counter on the specialist as well, pumping them up as well for big attacks. We're also running Solemn Simulacrum. This is basically an easy add-on to this deck. We're red and black, so we don't get a lot of ramp in this deck. So with this, allowing you to tutor one of your lands and put it on the battlefield and to be able to draw an extra card whenever it dies is very clutch and very key. I also decided to add Varchild, Betrayer of Keldor to this deck, a 3/3 for 3 legendary human knight. So whenever it deals combat damage to a player, that player creates that many 1/1 red survivor tokens. They can't block and they can't attack you or planeswalkers you control, and whenever Varchild dies, you get control of all the survivors. This way you're giving your opponents more creatures. So ultimately, if you haven't noticed from the last couple of cards we've been looking at, one of our strategies is to give our opponents creatures and protect ourselves as well from those creatures. Next, we're going to be looking at Varragoth, Blood Sky Sire, a 2/3 for 3 legendary demon rogue with Death Touch. This is one of the repeatable ways we're able to tutor in this deck. With Boast, basically you have to have it attacking, and then you could just pay 1 in the black to demonic tutor effectively. However, you have to activate it only as long as Varragoth is attacking and only once per turn. However, that's not the biggest issue in the world. Next, and lastly, we're going to look at Zaragast, Thief of Heartbeats, a 4/4 for 6. Basically, the spell costs 1 less for each creature in your party, but that's not completely relevant. Flying, Death Touch, and Haste. Other creatures you control have Death Touch, which is really strong. Whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a planeswalker, destroy that planeswalker. So, I mean, the first ability and the last ability are not very important to us. The Flying, Death Touch, and Haste on Zaragast is really good, and giving your other creatures Death Touch, very, very clutch. Next, we're going to look at our instants. We have a lot of instants in this deck. We're running about 14 of them, and we're going to get started right away with Abnormal Endurance. So this is one of the many cards in this deck that we're going to be looking at that utilize the same ability. However, what it is until the end of turn, target creature gets +2/+0 and gains. When this creature dies, return it to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control. We want to be using that triggered ability on Freddy as much as we can. That way, your opponents can't attack, they can't block, they can't use their activated abilities. So we want to sacrifice Freddy, get it back, Abnormal Endurance, or if he's getting targeted, same thing. Basically protects Freddy and its repeatable triggered abilities on him. Blood Pact is having target player draw 2 cards and lose 2 life. It's secondary Sign in Blood for 1 extra. Deadly Dispute is pretty good, especially if you want to pair it along with Abnormal Endurance, the card we just saw before. And additional, to cast the spell, you sacrifice an artifact or a creature, draw 2 cards, and create a treasure token. So basically, 2 cards and extra mana, really good. And like I said, if you pair this with Abnormal Endurance, you are basically getting a free Freddy trigger whenever he comes back on the field. Now, Demonic Gifts, as I mentioned before, is another abnormal endurance cards. Basically, whenever it dies, return to the battlefield under its owner's control, giving it a small little boost. Feign Death, again, same thing. With this one, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on it as well. Hellish Rebuke is another fun card I decided to add in this. You saw this card before in, I believe, the Lind build. The link's gonna be at the top right of the screen. If it's gonna be the Lind build, it's gonna be there. If not, then I'll correct it afterwards. Until the end of your turn, permanents opponents control gain. Whenever this permanent deals damage to the player who casts Hellish Rebuke, sacrifice this permanent, you lose 2 life. So this way, if your opponents are trying to go wide against you, you play Hellish Rebuke, and as long as you're able to survive the attack, or even still, whenever they deal damage to you and you're completely defenseless, they have to sacrifice their entire board, and that's a lot of damage going to your opponents as well if they're going wide. Hurl Through Hell is one of the removal cards we added in this deck. You exile a target creature, and until the end of your next turn, you may cast the card, and you can spend mana as low as it was mana of any color to cast a spell. So you get to exile a big scary creature, and you can play it on your side of the field if you so deem it. Infernal Grasp is one of our main get rid of stuff cards. Destroy target creature for 2/1 and a black, you lose 2 life. Shriveling Rot is an interesting card to decide to add in this deck. So this is one of the Entwine cards. You have to choose one for 4 mana, and you can entwine it for 7. There's 3 extra, but you choose one. Until end of turn, whenever a creature is dealt damage, destroy it, or until end of turn, whenever a creature is put into a graveyard from play, that creature's controller loses life equal to this toughness. So not only are you, if you entwine it, you get to destroy creatures whenever they're dealt damage, but whenever they die, your opponents lose life based on it. Very good for a 7 mana spell. Sudden Spoiling is a really fun card. I remember playing even back then, and it's always a fun card to spring on your opponents. So it's a split second card, which means it goes above the stack and you cannot respond to it. Creatures target player controls lose all abilities and have base power and toughness 0/2. Anytime your opponents are trying to go off, you play Sudden Spoiling and their plan is foiled. And with Freddy, you get to kill them immediately. Supernatural Stamina is another one of the abnormal endurance cards that we were talking about just before. Terminate is an easy kill spell, budget kill spell to add in the deck. Tragic Slip, budget enough. Target creature gets -1/-1 until end of turn, but it gets -13/-13 as long as a creature died that turn. And lastly, Undying Evil is target creature gains Undying until end of turn, which means it's basically another abnormal endurance card, except with Undying. So Freddy will come back with a -1/-1 counter when he does return back to the battlefield. Next, we're going to be taking a look at the artifacts. So we're running 13 artifacts in this deck, starting off with Bloodthirsty Blade. As you can tell, this has become a pet card. I add to almost every single one of my decks. And with this, enchanted creature gets +2/+0 and is goated. It's a 2 mana artifact, and for 1 mana, you attach the Bloodthirsty Blade to target creature an opponent controls. You can only activate it as a sorcery speed. However, goading your opponent's creatures, especially having them not attack you, is very clutch. Next is Commander Sphere. It's one of our main ramp cards. Tap it to add 1 mana of any color your commander's identity, and you sacrifice it to draw a card for 3 mana. Conjurer's Closet is probably the most expensive card in this deck, and I can't say enough about this card. This is probably the best card in this deck, allowing you to activate Freddy's ability multiple times. That way your opponents will not be able to attack or activate their abilities. Crown of Doom is another really expensive card, but I thought it was extremely funny. So whenever the creature attacks you or a planeswalker you control, it gets +2/+0 until end of turn. And for 2 mana, target player other than Crown of Doom's controller gains control of the crown. You activate this only during your turn. So you pass around the crown, and anytime your opponents attack that player with the crown, it gets +2/+0 until end of turn. So it's boosting up your opponent's creatures. Dreamstone Hedron is another ramp card that we're adding to this deck. Adds 3 colorless mana for 6 mana, tap it to sacrifice it to draw 3 cards. Expedition Map is a budget way to get more lands onto the battlefield. 1 mana artifact, but for 2 and tap it and sacrifice it, you get to search your library for land, put it into your hand, and then shuffle your library. Next is Fire Diamond. Tapping, it comes into play tapped and you tap it for a red mana. Mask of Avacyn is another one of our equipments, allowing you to enchant a creature to give it +1/+2 and give it hexproof. Mimic Vac is another way we're going to be getting a lot of creature tokens. So whenever a non-token creature dies, you can put it under the Mimic Vac, and for 3 and tap it, you create a token that's a copy of it, and you just exile at the beginning of the next end step. Mind Stone is extra basic ramp, adding a colorless, it's a 2 mana artifact, and for 1, tap it and sacrifice the Mind Stone to draw a card. Rakdos Locket is easy ramp, 3 mana artifact, tap it for a black or a red, and for 4 hybrid mana, tap it and sacrifice the locket to draw 2 cards. Strixhaven Stadium is a card I pondered about putting in. However, I thought it was just way too funny not to add it. You get to tap it for 3 mana, you tap it for a colorless, and you put a point counter on Strixhaven Stadium. Whenever a creature an opponent controls deals combat damage to you, you remove a point counter from Strixhaven Stadium. And whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to an opponent, you put a point counter on Strixhaven Stadium. Then if it has 10 or more point counters, you remove them all, and that player loses the game. This is an alternative win con in the deck. I don't suppose this is ever going to go off in this deck. However, it's always fun to just completely outright destroy somebody with Strixhaven Stadium. And lastly, Warren Power Stone coming into play, tap and adding 2 colorless mana. Next, we're looking at our enchantments. We're running 12 of them. We're going to get started right away with Court of Ambition and Court of Ire. These two cards are the other 2 Monarch cards that we're running in this deck. Both of them have very varying abilities, but both of them start off whenever it enters the battlefield, you become the Monarch. Court of Ambition basically has, whenever at the beginning of your upkeep, each opponent loses 3 life unless they discard a card. And if you're the Monarch, they each lose 6 life unless they discard 2 cards instead. And Court of Ire basically deals 2 damage to any target, but if you're the Monarch, it deals 7 damage to that player or permanent instead. Curse of Disturbance is another fun card I decided to add in this deck. You've seen this before in the Lind Brew that I just did last week. Enchant a player with this curse. Whenever that player is attacked, you create a 2/2 black zombie creature token, and each opponent didn't do the same thing. This rewards your opponents for attacking each other opponent. And imagine this with the Crown of Dune on there. Each one of those zombies is going to become a 4/2. Kaya's Ghost Form is another abnormal endurance. However, this is a longer lasting one. You enchant a creature, and whenever it dies or is put into the exile, you turn it to the battlefield under your control. Obviously, you want to put this on Freddy, so whenever he dies or gets exiled, he comes right back, and that activated ability comes back on the field with him. Parasitic Impetus and Shiny Impetus are our 2 goad auras in this deck. You enchant a creature, it gets +2/+2 and is goaded. So both of them are very spotty cards, especially as long as you're going to be able to pump up your opponent's creatures and then use Freddy's ability to just get rid of them. Rite of the Raging Storm. With this card, it's a 5 mana enchantment, and creatures named Lightning Rager can't attack you or planeswalkers you control, which is a bonus. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player creates a 5/1 red elemental creature token that's named Lightning Rager, and it has trample, haste, and at the beginning of the end step, sacrifice the creature. With this, you create each player is creating a 5/1 elemental with trample and haste. 1, 2. If somebody has the Crown of Doom on there, it's an extra +2. And 3. Freddy can easily just knock one of these off before combat and ultimately just make your opponents lose 5 life. The Crone War is next. It's the only Saga we're running in this deck, a 4 mana Saga, with the first one being gain control of target creature as long as the Crone War remains on the battlefield. The second lore is until your next turn, creatures your opponents control attack each combat if able. And third, each tapped creature deals damage to its equal to its power. Vampiric Rites is one of our only sacrifice engines with this. 1 on a black to sacrifice a creature, you gain a life and draw a card. It's extra card draw, but as long as you have this and an ability like a normal endurance or Kaya's Ghost Form attached to Freddy, you get to draw an extra card based on the death, and then Freddy will come back on the field. That being said, it doesn't just work for Freddy. It works for any one of the creatures that you take possession of. It works with any one of the tokens that we're creating, losing some life but drawing some extra cards. And the last 3 cards we're going to be looking at are all the vows. So Vow of Lightning, Vow of Malice, and Vow of Torment. So each one of these reads the exact same. It's just in a different color combination. It's one of the aura. It's an aura that enchants a creature that creature gains +2/+2, has either First Strike based on the Vow of Lightning, has Intimidate on the Vow of Malice, and has Menace from the Vow of Torment, and each one of them can't attack you or a planeswalker you control. So you're giving your opponents a buff, I should say, with one of these vows, either First Strike, Intimidate, or Menace, +2/+2, but at the sole cost of them not being able to attack you. The second to last category we're going to tackle is our sorceries. Each of these gives us a fun little boost to it, and we only run 7 this. We run twice as many instants than we do sorceries in this deck. Since sorceries, we can only do it on our turn, and we want to be more fast-paced with this deck. We're going to first start off with Awaken the Erstwhile, a 5-mana sorcery that each player discards all the cards in their hand, and they create that many 2/2 black zombie creature tokens. So, effectively, if you have a bad hand, you can just dump it to get more creatures on the field. And with Vampiric Rites, those 2/2s are extra fodder for you to draw extra cards, as long as you have the mana for it. And that being said, it also works for if your opponents are over-tutored for a card, or if you know they're going to be winning on their turn. You just play Awaken the Entwurst, they have to discard their hand, and they get those zombies on the field. Diabolic Tutor, I should say, is our main tutor ability. You've seen this in every single black deck I brew on this channel. It comes as no surprise. You search your library for a card, put the card into your hand, then shuffle your library for 4 mana. Disrupt Decorum, I am surprised went down in price, is a sorcery for 2 red that says go to all creatures you don't control. This is strong, which means each one of your opponent's creatures gets goated. They can't attack you or planeswalkers you control if able, and they have to attack each turn, if able. It's extremely powerful, which means you're going to be turning your opponents on each other. Feed the Swarm is another one of our killed spells. For 1 in the black mana, you destroy target creature or enchantment an opponent controls, and you lose life equal to that permanent's mana value. Fevered Suspicion is our most mana value costly cards. Reading, each opponent exiles cards from the top of their library until they exile a non-land card. You may cast any number of spells from among those non-land cards without paying their mana costs, and it has Rebound. So for 8 mana, you get at the base minimum 3 extra new cards, and then it rebounds to the next turn, so you get to play it all over again, and you're basically getting more cards on your side of the field without having to cast it. I think that's a win in my books. Read the Bones is extra card draw. It's scry 2, draw 2, and lose 2 for 3 mana. And Last Sign in Blood, easy add-on to this. 2 mana, target player draws 2 cards and loses 2 life. And the last category we're going to be talking about is our lands. We're running 35 lands, and these are the most important part of our deck, if I haven't stressed that enough already. First off, we're going to be taking a look at is Ash Barrens. It's a colorless land that taps for colorless, but it has basic land cycling 1, which means you get to discard the card, and you get to tutor for whatever basic land you need in the moment. The next 3 are Evolving Wilds, Terramorphic Expanse, and Myriad Landscape. You've already heard me talk about this in great depth before. However, these are important cards, especially in these colors, where you get to sacrifice them and get the colors you need on the field. Evolving Wild and Terramorphic Expanse are just sack them and get a basic land onto the battlefield tapped. Myriad Landscape, on the other hand, comes into play tapped. It can tap for a colorless mana, but for 2 and tap it and sacrifice, you get to put up to 2 basic lands onto the battlefield tapped. And we're also running 14 mountains and 17 swamps. And that's how you build a maniacal gardener with a knife glove on his hand with our budget of $50, which includes the price of the commander and excludes the price of the basic lands. We're looking at a price of around $56.55, which puts us over our budget. Ultimately, we wanted to make this under $55, or at the very best, $50 at the best. This goes a little bit over. However, if you have that extra money to shill, you can easily make this deck playable. So this is not exactly a playable deck. As you can tell, there's no official card for Freddy Kruger until maybe WotC or Secret Lair wants to drop a special 80s horror movie, 80s slasher or horror movie icon list like they did with The Walking Dead. If you are, give me a call. I might be able to give you some help with that. Nonetheless, this is just for fun, so the price doesn't exactly matter too much. Now, let's go over some of the pros and let's go over some of the cons of this deck. So we'll go over the pros and cons now. Some of the pros to this deck is that there's a lot of instant speed interaction. As named off before, we have 14 instant speed cards, meaning that we are able to do a lot of things at a very fast pace, ranging from stuff that gets Freddy back on the battlefield to exiling and destroying creatures, all the way to even just having all your opponents losing all their creatures' abilities and becoming 0/2s. The commander has both a triggered ability and an activated ability, which means that it is very versatile in what it wants to do. If you had this card, or if this card was actually real, you could build this in many different ways. The way I built it was a bit of both. Having to rely on the triggered ability whenever Freddy Kruger enters the battlefield is really strong, basically allowing your opponents to just completely waste a turn from attacks and furthering their position. And the activated ability to destroy a creature and controller lose life based on its power is really, really strong, especially with all the goat cards and all the vows that we put in this deck. It's just a no-brainer that you could focus on that aspect as well. There's a good amount of enter the battlefield and protection cards. When I built this deck initially, this brew, basically a lot of what I thought was going to be a lot of enter the battlefield triggers, especially with Conjurer's Closet being the first card, or one of the first cards I added in this deck. However, a lot of it just turned into a very value-based deck, ultimately ranging from enter the battlefield triggers like Freddy Kruger, the Hunted Dragon and Horror, and to value-based stuff like Florian, Karizakar, Carter, Kazul, you name it. There's a lot of value in this, and it also protects Freddy with 5 instant speed interactive cards. And the last pro we're looking at here is that it is very good at diverting attacks. So as I mentioned before, with a lot of the gold cards, with Disrupt Decorum, with all the vows and everything like that, you are basically averting your opponents from attacking you as best as you can. You're playing a very defensive strategy. With this deck, like even Agitator Ant and Kazul and Fumiko are very defensive cards ultimately. So that means you're very much avoiding your opponents from attacking you, avoiding the attacks and inevitable death, and you get to profit off those attacks with Freddy Krueger's ability, and you get to profit off them with different cards as well. And some of the cons in this deck is that the most notable one is that it's very inconsistent. As I mentioned before, this is a deck that doesn't have a very straightforward direction with it. It's kind of all over the place in terms of what it wants to do. However, a lot of the focus is that it wants to be very defensive while utilizing the Freddy Krueger enter the battlefield trigger, and using the activated ability as a win con ultimately. So, but just in terms of general gameplay and in terms of general testing, it's not very consistent with what it wants to do on a regular basis. So it does require a lot of work. The next is that there's very poor ramp in this deck. Being that we have 7 pieces of ramp in this deck and 35 lands is not the worst in the world. However, it's not, as long as if you don't get any one of those ramp cards, you're kind of screwed, especially if you end up with a hand that doesn't have enough colors that you need to cast all the spells you need. Being that Freddy Krueger is a hybrid 4 mana gives you a lot of advantage to it. However, it could be unfavorable for you to play extra cards further down the line, especially based on whatever ramp you don't or have, or whatever ramp you do have, could be very limiting. And lastly, it can easily be stopped. Basically, any board wipe can just wipe away this entire board. Getting rid of Freddy very early on can ruin your plans. Getting rid of Conjurer's Closet is very smart in this case. However, against you, it would hurt you a lot. Like, this deck does not, despite it being very protective, especially in terms of combat damage, it's not very protective in terms of removal or board wipes ultimately. And some of the out of budget cards that I would recommend to put in this deck, should it be real, or if you ever want to play this on a further basis, the first of which would be Sword of Hearth and Home. I've taken a look at this card and it's very strong in this deck, basically not only allowing you to get an extra land on the battlefield, but you get to exile Freddy and put him back on the field at each and every time he deals damage, or anytime your opponents deal damage. This way, you're easily getting that trigger ability from the enter the battlefield, and you're getting some extra ramp on the field as well. The next one I would recommend would be Helm of the Host. This is just an easy add in this deck. Helm of the Host could go into any deck that with a creature that has an enter the battlefield ability. Now, with Helm of the Host and with Freddy Kruger on the field. Whenever it gets your combat, basically you create a token of Freddy Kruger. Each one of your opponent's creatures can't block, and then you just swing out. It's very strong. And this happens with each combat that you have Helm the Host on Freddy Kruger. Next would be Revel in Riches. This would be an easy win con, especially with the secondary, the activated ability that Freddy has. With this way, you just kill 10 creatures, you get 10 treasure tokens. Those treasure tokens could be used for further spells down the line. However, you can keep those for the 10 mana and win the game ultimately like that. And the last one would be, I would recommend to put in this deck, would be Massacre Worm. Massacre Worm does so much work for you. You get to mini board wipe with Massacre Worm, and whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, that player loses 2 life. It does so much work for you, especially with all the creatures that come into play. Especially with creatures that we give you, that this deck gives you, that comes into play. Like the Cronan Horse gives you 1/1s. The Hunted Dragon gives you 2/2s. Yeah, Varchild gives your opponents 1/1s as well. Just to give you a good example of that, you're giving opponents creatures, and with Massacre Worm, each one of those creatures dying takes a toll on their life total, ultimately. I mean, that's going to do it for today, guys. What do you guys think of this new deck tech? Do you think this is a fun idea? Do you want me to do this more throughout the rest of the month? Let me know in the comments down below. Again, as I mentioned to you before, you can follow me on my socials in the bottom left-hand side of your screen. You have my TikTok, my Twitter, my Instagram, and my Facebook. If you want to suggest any ideas for any future videos, or if you just want to hit me up on one of them, feel free to contact me on one of those platforms. I'm very responsive to my messages. And if you enjoyed this video and you found some entertainment out of this, don't forget to like this video, share it amongst your friends, subscribe to the channel, and hit that bell icon, because not only would I truly appreciate it, but this will also help the channel grow and get some more exposure and get to a lot bigger audience as well. I post every Friday at 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, which means I get the East Coast and the West Coast very, very early. And stick around for next week's video, because I'm going to be doing another one of these horror brews. And I'm not going to tell you anymore. You're just going to have to watch next week and see who's going to be. So until then, guys, stay safe, have a great week, enjoy yourselves, and I'll see you guys next week. And cheers, everybody.